What if the last name you carry today survived 1,000 years of war, invasion, and empire, only to almost disappear forever in a single decade? That is exactly what happened to millions of Irish families between 1845 and 1855, and the surnames that made it through that crossing are still alive in America right now. If you have ever wondered where your Irish name really comes from, or whether your family was touched by the worst humanitarian disaster in European history, stay with me, because what you're about to hear goes much deeper than a list. And if this is the kind of history that makes you feel something, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who carries one of these names. They need to hear this story too. Let us go back to the beginning, not to a ship, who carries one of these names. They need to hear this story too. Let us go back to the beginning, not to a ship, not to a harbor, to a field. Imagine a farmer in County Cork in the autumn of 1845. He walks out to his potato plot in the early morning. The stalks look strange, dark, wet. He pulls one from the earth and it crumbles in his hand, black and rotting from the inside. He pulls another, same thing. He walks the whole row and finds the same destruction over and over. By earth and it crumbles in his hand, black and rotting from the inside. He pulls another, same thing. He walks the whole row and finds the same destruction over and over. By nightfall, the smell of rot hangs over the entire valley. That smell would define the next 10 years of Irish history. A water mold called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland in 1845 and tore through the potato crop with terrifying speed. For a third of the Irish population, the potato was not just a food, it was the only food. There was no backup, there was no savings account, there was no safety. A potato was not just a food, it was the only food. There was no backup, there was no savings account, there was no safety. Net, when the potato failed, people simply began to starve. The population of Ireland before the famine stood at around 8.5 million people. By 1851, it had fallen to 6.5 million. Roughly 1 million people died of starvation and the diseases that followed it. Typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever, and more than 1 million others fled the island. During the famine years themselves, the exodus kept going long after the blight ended. By 1855, close to 2 million people had made the crossing to America. Every single one of them carried a surname. And here's the part that matters most for anyone watching this with an Irish last name. The famine struck hardest in the poor, rural Irish-speaking counties of the west and south of Ireland. These were the counties where the ancient Gaelic surnames were most deeply rooted. So the names that poured into American cities between 1845 and 1855 were not a random cross-section of Ireland. They were the oldest names the island had ever produced. These are 17 of them. Pay attention, because one of them may be yours. The first name is Murphy. In Irish, the original form is O Murchada, meaning descendant of Murchad. That name breaks down into two older words, Muir, meaning sea, and Cath, meaning battle. Put them together and you get Sea Warrior. It is the single most common surname in all of Ireland, and it is the most common Irish surname across America. The heartland of the Murphy family was County Wexford, where the Sept descended from the ancient kings of Leinster. Separate Murphy families also existed in Cork and Ulster. The small tenant farmers of Wexford were exactly the class of people the famine destroyed, and Murphys left through the ports of New Ross and Liverpool by the thousands. One detail worth holding on to, Murchad was also the name of Brian Boru's eldest son, who fell fighting beside his father at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. The name was royal long before it became the most common name in the country. The second name is Kelly. The Irish original is O Ceallaigh, and the meaning of the personal name Ceallaigh is genuinely disputed among scholars. Some read it as bright-headed, others connect it to strife or contention. A third group links it to seal, the Irish word for church. What nobody disputes is the geography. The Great O'Kelly Sept ruled the kingdom of Uí, Maine, a territory that stretched across East Galway and South Roscommon for centuries. Roscommon lost nearly a third of its entire population during the famine decade, one of the worst losses of any county in Ireland. That is why Kelly sits near the top of Irish surname records in Boston, New York, and Chicago to this day. The third name is not just old, it is royal in the most literal sense. O'Brien, the Irish form is O'Brien, descendant of Brian, and not just any Brian. This is the bloodline of Brian Boru himself, the king of Dalcase from County Clare, Brian, and not just any Brian. This is the bloodline of Brian Boru himself, the king of Dalcase from County Clare, who fought his way to the high kingship of all Ireland. He died at the Battle of Clontarf on Good Friday in the year 1014 at the moment of his greatest military victory. His descendants ruled Thomond, the kingdom of North Munster, for 5 more centuries after his death. Clare was devastated in the famine years, with people dying in workhouses and fleeing through the port of Limerick. If your name is O'Brien, Brian, or Brian in any American spelling, you carry the most celebrated royal surname Ireland ever produced. The fourth name is Ryan. Almost every Ryan in the world traces back to a single sept, O Mau Ilrian, meaning devotee of Rian. That personal name likely comes from Ri, the Irish word for king, a little king. Their single sept, O Mau Ilrian, meaning devotee of Rian. That personal name likely comes from Ri, the Irish word for king, a little king. Their territory sat on the border between County Tipperary and County Limerick, and they barely spread beyond that area. This makes Ryan one of the most geographically concentrated surnames in all of Irish history. Tipperary was hit mercilessly during the famine years, with landlords running some of the largest eviction campaigns in the entire country. Tens of thousands of Ryans went through Liverpool and on to America and Australia. If your name is Ryan, you have a rare degree of certainty in Irish genealogy. Your roots almost certainly point to Tipperary or Limerick. The fifth name is O'Sullivan. The Irish form is O Suilia Byrne, and scholars have argued about the second element for 200 years. Suil means eye in Irish. What comes after it has been translated as one-eyed, hawk-eyed, and dark-eyed. Nobody fully agrees. The O'Sullivans were princes of a great Munster dynasty, pushed out of Tipperary by the Norman invasion, and driven into the mountains of the Beara Peninsula in West Cork, and the Éireacht Peninsula in Kerry. West Cork was the epicenter of the famine's worst suffering. The town of Skibbereen became so infamous for its mass graves, the peninsula in Kerry. West Cork was the epicenter of the famine's worst suffering. The town of Skibbereen became so infamous for its mass graves that newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic printed its name like a warning. Land records from the 1850s show nearly 6,000 O'Sullivan households recorded in Cork and Kerry alone. The name drained out of those two counties and into every Irish neighborhood in America. The sixth name carries a twist. Walsh is not Gaelic at all. It comes from Brethnach, the Irish word for Welshman or Briton, and it was given to the Welsh and Cambro-Norman soldiers who arrived with the Anglo-Norman invasion of 1169. Within a few generations, those families had gone fully native, learned the language, intermarried, and become as Irish as anyone on the island. Walsh became the fourth most common surname in Ireland, strongest in Mayo, Kilkenny, Waterford, and Wexford. County Mayo suffered as terribly as anywhere in the country during the famine. Entire villages in the west of the county simply ceased to exist between 1846 and 1851. So the Walshes who boarded those ships carried a name that originally meant foreigner, and they were leaving the only home their families had ever known. The seventh name is O'Connor. The Irish form is O. Conchobar, descendant of Conchobar, a name usually translated as lover of hounds. The senior line descends from a 9th century king of Connacht, and this family gave Ireland her last two recognized high kings, Turlough O'Connor and his son Rory, who died in 1198. Their homeland was County Roscommon, though separate O'Connor septs also ruled in Kerry, Clare, Offaly, Sligo, and Derry, Rela, meaning Kerry, Clare, Offaly, Sligo, and Derry, meaning this name has at least 6 distinct points of geographic origin across Ireland. Roscommon and Kerry both lost enormous portions of their populations during the famine decade. When an O'Connor stepped off a ship in New York Harbor, the name the immigration clerk wrote down was the surname of deposed kings. The 8th name is McCarthy. In Irish, McCarthy, son of Carthach, and Carthach means loving. A quiet, gentle meaning for one of the most powerful war dynasties in Irish history. The McCarthys were the ruling family of a great Munster royal line, driven south into Cork in the 12th century, where they reigned as kings of Desmond. It was a McCarthy who built Blarney Castle in 1446. About 6 in every 10 McCarthy families come from County Cork, and Cork sent more famine. A McCarthy who built Blarney Castle in 1446. About 6 in every 10 McCarthy families come from County Cork, and Cork sent more famine emigrants through its harbour at Cove than almost any port in Ireland. That harbour town was renamed Queenstown in 1849, and for the next century it was the last piece of Irish land that millions of departing emigrants would ever see. Now, before we continue, if you are finding this fascinating and you're not subscribed yet, this is your moment. Tap subscribe right now and ring the bell because this channel goes deep into the real documented history behind the names and bloodlines of the English-speaking world. Every video is built on primary sources, not myths. You deserve that level of honesty in your family history. Now let us keep going. The 9th name is Gallagher. The Irish form is O Galchopair, built from Gaul, meaning foreigner, and Cobhair, meaning help. Together, suggesting this form is O Galchopair, built from Gaul, meaning foreigner, and Cobhair, meaning help. Together, suggesting an ancestor celebrated for fighting alongside outside allies. This is the great name of County Donegal, descended from the Sinel Canale, the same royal family that produced St. Colmcille. Land records from the famine era show over 1,700 Gallagher households in Donegal alone. Gallagher remains the most common surname in that county to this day. The smallholders of Donegal clung to tiny potato plots on the thin Atlantic soil of the northwest coast. When the crop failed, they had absolutely nothing to fall back on. Gallagher scattered to Scotland, to Pennsylvania's coal country, and to the mill towns of New England. The 10th name is Doyle. The Irish form is O Dubagail, descendant of the dark foreigner. Dubgal was the term Irish people used for the Danish Vikings, as opposed to the fair-haired Norwegians. This means every Doyle carries a Gaelic surname that commemorates a Viking ancestor who settled in Ireland, converted, married into the community, and stayed. The Doyle families clustered along the southeast, coast in Wexford, Wicklow, and Carlow, precisely the coastline where Norse longships had been landing for centuries. Wexford's famine emigrants left through New Ross and Waterford in enormous numbers. A Viking heritage wrapped in a Gaelic name, carried to America on a famine ship. Very few surnames compress that much layered history into just 2 syllables. The 11th name is Kennedy. The Irish form is O Sinedag, from Cian, meaning head, and a second element debated as ugly or helmeted. Neither translation is flattering, but both are very Irish in their bluntness. The Kennedys were Dal Case, the same Clare dynasty as the O'Briens, which means at their earliest roots the 2 families are cousins. The sept later established itself strongly in North Tipperary, and one particular Kennedy story captures the entire arc of the famine in miniature. In 1848, a young man named Patrick Kennedy left the townland of Dunganstown near New Ross in County Wexford and sailed for Boston with almost nothing to his name. 113 years later, his great-grandson, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. In June of 1963, President Kennedy stood in the farmyard his great-grandfather had walked away from and looked at the people who had stayed behind. The 12th name is Byrne. The Irish form is O'Broin, descendant of Bran, and Bran means raven. The Byrnes descended from a king of Leinster who died in 1052. When the Normans took the Leinster lowlands in the 12th century, the Byrne family retreated into the Wicklow Mountains and spent 4 centuries raiding down toward Dublin, close enough to Dublin Castle to be a permanent problem for the English administration. Today, Byrne is among the most common surnames in both Dublin and Wicklow. The famine drove Byrnes through the port of Dublin, across to Liverpool, and onward to America in very large numbers. Ravens' descendants, mountain fighters, and then steerage passengers, all in one name. The 13th name has 2 completely separate origins. An honest history requires saying so. Lynch. One line is Norman. The de Lynch family settled in Galway and became the most powerful of the famous 14 tribes of Galway, providing the city with dozens of its mayors over the centuries. But the greater number of Irish Lynches descend from the Gaelic O Loingsai, meaning mariner or seafarer, from Loingseach, related to the Irish word for ship. The Gaelic Lynches were strongest in Cork, Cavan, Clare, and Limerick. In famine-era land records, County Cork alone held over 650 Lynch households. 2 separate bloodlines, one shared. Spelling, both recorded on the immigrant ships. The 14th name is Murray. The Irish form is O Muiriad High, from Muir, meaning sea, often translated as seafarer or lord of the sea. The main Irish sept belonged to the Uí Main territory around Roscommon, with other branches in Cork and Down. One important caution for anyone researching this name: Murray is also a major Scottish surname derived from the ancient province of Moray. An American Murray genuinely needs documentary evidence before claiming the Irish line with confidence. That said, famine-era records show well over 4,000 Murray households spread across Ireland, and the name moves steadily through the ports for the entire famine decade. The 15th name is Quinn. The Irish form is O Quinn, descendant of Con, a name meaning sense, intelligence, or chief. The same ancient root appears in names like Connaught. There were several distinct Quinn septs, one in Thomond and Clare, one in Longford, and the largest in County Tyrone, where Quinn remains the single most common surname in the county to this day. Ulster's famine story is told less often than the West's, but Tyrone and its neighboring counties lost enormous numbers to both death and emigration. Many Ulstermen left through Derry on ships bound for Philadelphia and Quebec. A significant number of Appalachian Quinn families trace back through exactly that Derry to Pennsylvania corridor. The 16th name is More, in Irish, O'Morda, from Morda, meaning stately, noble, or proud. The O'Moores were the leading family of the 7 septs of Loas and resisted the English plantation of their county across multiple generations. In the famine era, More was widespread across Loa, Antrim, and beyond. One honest caveat: More is also a common English surname with no Gaelic connection whatsoever. But if your Moore ancestors were Catholic and arrived In America, between 1845 and 1855, the Gaelic origin is the stronger probability. The passenger manifests of the late 1840s are full of them, and the 17th name, the last on this list, might be the most fitting of all, Connolly. The Irish form is O Conghaile, from Conghal, meaning valiant or fierce as a hound. The chief sept belonged to County Monaghan with other branches in Galway, Cork, and Meath. Monaghan, a county of small hillside. This list might be the most fitting of all, Connolly. The Irish form is O Conghaile, from Conghal, meaning valiant or fierce as a hound. The chief sept belonged to County Monaghan with other branches in Galway, Cork, and Meath. Monaghan, a county of small hillside farms, lost close to a third of its people in the famine decade, and the most famous bearer of this name was himself a child of that outflow. James Connolly, the Labour leader and Irish Republican executed after the Easter Rising, on May 12, 1916, was born in Edinburgh to Monaghan parents who had left Ireland in the post-famine wave of emigration. The name means valiant. He spent his entire life in Ireland in the post-famine wave of emigration. The name means valiant. He spent his entire life, making that meaning real. Those are the 17. Now, before you go searching passenger lists or ancestry databases, there's one piece of family legend that needs to be corrected, because it trips up more researchers than almost anything else in Irish genealogy. You have probably heard that the family name was changed at Ellis Island, that the clerk could not spell it, so he wrote something different and the original was lost forever. It is a compelling story. It is also impossible for any famine-era family. Ellis Island did not open until 1892, more than 40 years after the worst years of the famine. Families who fled Ireland in 1847 or 1848 landed in a completely different America before any federal immigration inspection system existed. 1847 or 1848 landed in a completely different America before any federal immigration inspection system existed. Even Castle Garden in New York, the earliest processing point in the city, did not open until 1855. The names in the American historical record came directly from ship manifests written out in Cork, Dublin, Derry, and, this surprises most people, Liverpool, which was actually the single busiest departure point for Irish famine emigrants. More people sailed from the Mersey River than from any harbor in Ireland itself. If your family's spelling changed, it changed slowly, through American courthouse clerks, census takers with their own interpretations, parish registers written in a new country's handwriting, and children who grew up speaking English and started spelling their own names differently. That is a real and important kind of change. It just did not happen at Ellis Island. One more thing worth understanding about those O and Mac prefixes. Under British rule, and particularly through the 18th and 19th centuries, the O and the Mac were widely dropped as Irish families anglicized. It was often a survival decision, a way to blend in, avoid discrimination, find work. So O Suiliab Hyan became plain Sullivan. O Tiale became plain Kelly. Then the Gaelic cultural revival, sparked partly by the founding of the Gaelic League in 1893, inspired thousands of families to reclaim those prefixes. Some names, like O'Brien, kept the prefix through most of the Anglicization period. Others, like Kelly and Murphy, almost never took it back even after the revival. Whether your family wears the O or the Mac or neither, the Gaelic root underneath is identical. Here is something worth pausing on before this ends, because this matters. A surname alone is not proof of a specific family line. Murphy has multiple unrelated septs across different provinces. Lynch has two completely separate ethnic origins. Murray might be Irish or might be Scottish. A common surname is a strong and meaningful signal. It tells you the region, the approximate era, the cultural world your ancestors came from. But it is not a finished pedigree. The real evidence lives in documents, ship manifests from the 1840s and 1850s, Catholic parish registers of baptisms and marriages, Griffith's valuation land records from the 1850s, and the American Census trail from 1850 forward. Those documents are where a family story becomes a family fact. Now think about something. Those people on those ships in 1847, they were leaving behind everything they had ever known. Their land, their language, their dead. They were carrying almost nothing onto those overcrowded vessels. No money, no guarantee of survival on the 6-week crossing, no certainty of what waited on the other side. But there was one thing they carried that no landlord could take, no blight could rot, and no ocean could wash away. Their names. Names that were already 1,000 years old when they stepped onto those ships. Names that had survived the Norman invasion, the Elizabethan wars, the Cromwellian confiscations, the penal laws, and the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. Names rooted in ancient Irish words for sea and battle, for raven and hound, for sea and battle, for raven and hound, for king and foreigner and love. And those names survived the crossing too. They are in the phone books of Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia and New York. They are on headstones in Appalachian cemeteries. They are signed to letters in the National Archives. They are on the lips of people who have no idea their great-great-grandmother left a Wicklow mountainside with nothing but that name and the will to survive. If one of these 17 names is yours, you are not just carrying a word. You are carrying the evidence that someone in your family made it through something almost unsurvivable and chose to keep their name when they got to the other side. That is not a small thing. That is an inheritance worth knowing. Before you go anywhere, drop your surname in the comments below. Tell us the county if you know it, and if you have found anything in your own research, share that too. The connections that form in the comments section of this channel are some of the most remarkable things we have ever seen. Your name might be the missing piece in someone else's family story. And when you are ready for more, the story of the great English surnames, where they came from, what they meant, and how they crossed the Atlantic long before the famine, is already waiting for you on this channel.